So we should be able to have kind of a discussion about what we're going to discuss today. Who did the reading? Who knows what we're talking about today? Delta. What's he talk about in there?
Yes, no. Basically, like, do we have free will, and is that and if we have free will, and we're not responsible for the choices, are responsible for the way we are.
Right.
It's a lot. It was a lot.
It's a lot to consider. He's offering us an overview of kind of contemporary debates surrounding free will and moral responsibility. And this is by and large a metaphysical question, because what we're going to be talking about today is whether or not we can be the kinds of things that have the ability to choose between options. Do we actually have choices? Can we do otherwise than what we do? Do we have free will? And if we don't, first of all, what does that imply about how our minds and our bodies work, about whether or not we have souls? And what does that imply about moral responsibility? If nobody has free will, can anybody be morally responsible for anything? A lot of people would say no. So this is a very difficult question to answer, and I mean, philosophers and theologians have been debating this question for thousands of years. We see a recommendation near the end of this essay about what we should do about this debate. Strawson thinks that we've been having this debate for too long, it hasn't really gotten us anywhere, and so we need a new strategy if we're going to talk about this issue. So today we're going to be talking about free will. And again, this is going to be more discussion-based, so we'll actually get to hear what your opinions are and what you think about some of these issues. So, the first thing that we need to do, if we're going to have a discussion like this, is we need to define our terms. This is something that we don't do enough in our conversations nowadays. Philosophy tip number 1. Whenever you're talking with someone about any issue and you're actually trying to get to the bottom of something, make sure you and all the other parties involved define your terms. Because you can talk around each other for hours without getting anywhere, and it's just going to result in anger, right? This has happened to all of us. So first, we're going to define our terms here. I said last class that if you take on the contemporary scientific view of what the universe is made of and how it works, that may imply that we don't have any free will. What was lurking in the background of that claim that I made was this view of the universe, which is known as determinism. Determinism is linked to the contemporary scientific view of the universe. Determinism is the view, this is how Strawson defines it. It's the view that everything that happens in the universe is necessitated by what has already come before. And what this implies is that nothing can happen other than how it does. And he defines this on page 1 of the essay. In other words, determinism is basically the view that what happens was caused by what happened before. If you're thinking in scientific terms, if you believe that the universe is deterministic, which most scientists do, then everything that is happening now, the seeds of that were planted when the Big Bang happened, at the start of the universe. So there were a certain set of initial conditions that brought our universe into existence, and that set of initial conditions determined what was possible and what was going to happen in the future. What this implies is that what happens necessarily happens, and nothing can happen otherwise than how it does. So if the universe is deterministic, you didn't have a choice about coming to class today. You're here. The fact that you're here means that you had to be here in some sense logically. There's nothing else that could have happened. Whatever's going on in your brain, whatever's going on in the world that caused you to be here, it couldn't be any other way. You had to be here today logically. And this is proven by the fact that you're here listening to my lecture. So when I said last class that the contemporary scientific view of the universe implies that we don't have free will, what I left out was the contemporary scientific view is deterministic. It takes a deterministic view of how events unfold in our universe. So if you believe, like the contemporary scientific view does, that we're just physical beings, just made of atoms and energy and protons and electrons that are being manipulated by the laws of physics, then whatever's going on in your head, whatever ideas you're having, whatever your body's doing, that's basically just something that's happening to you. It's just your internal chemical and physical processes making you move and think in a certain way. And you don't have control over really what happens or how you act or how you perceive things. So if we're going to have a debate about free will, we need to discuss whether or not this is true, which we're going to get to in a little bit. We should also define what free will is if we're going to be talking about it. Now, there are a few different definitions for this. I'm going to present what I think are the two most popular, or at least the most common. One definition of free will is kind of the commonsensical definition. It's having the ability to choose what one thinks and does. Can you read this back there, or is that too light for you? Is it okay? This is kind of how we think about free will when we have these sorts of discussions, right? If we say someone has free will, what we're saying is they have the ability to choose between the options before them, right? You can either bring your water bottle to class or you can leave it in your room. You can either have the hamburger for lunch or you can have the pasta. And you have a real choice here if you think you have free will, right? You're not determined to eat the pasta. You're not determined to wear the clothes that you wore today. You could have worn another set of clothes. So we can define free will roughly as having the ability to choose how you think and act. Another way of defining free will, because this definition is a little thorny and it's a little sticky as we're going to see, is that which is required for moral responsibility. Ever since the time of the ancients and up until today, there's been this general view that people who don't have control over their actions aren't morally responsible for those actions, right? If I implanted a chip in your brain and I was controlling your thoughts and your actions, we wouldn't blame you then if you went out and murdered someone, right? It wouldn't be you doing that. It was me that made you do that, right? If I'm the master controller. So some people like to define free will in this way because they see free will and moral responsibility as tied up. A lot of people think that if you don't have free will, you're not morally responsible for what you do because you didn't have a choice, right? You were just determined to do the thing that you did. You were determined to lie to your mom. You were determined to murder that guy, and you couldn't do otherwise. So these are kind of some of the definitions that we're going to be relying on today in the lecture, and as we have our discussion after I kind of present what Strawson has to say. Does anybody have any questions about these two terms? Okay, if you do, I think it'll become a little more clear as we go through this. Now let me present to you the different camps or sides of the free will debate. Obviously, not everybody believes the same stuff about this free will question, so there are different positions and different camps that have been formed that take oppositional stances as to whether or not determinism is true, and therefore whether or not we have free will. The first camp is what is known as incompatibilism. And incompatibilism says exactly how it sounds. The incompatibilists believe that free will and determinism are incompatible. In other words, if determinism is true, the incompatibilists believe we don't have free will. But if it turns out that we have free will, that must mean that determinism is false. That everything in the future is not determined to happen the way that it is. There's some leeway. There's some choice in the matter. Now, just because you're an incompatibilist, that doesn't actually say whether or not you believe free will exists. There are two kind of subcamps to incompatibilism. One of you is known as hard determinism. And the other is known as libertarianism. If you had to guess, what do you think the hard determinists believe? Yeah. Right. They're going to say determinism is true, so free will doesn't exist. What do you think the libertarians are going to say?
Well, that free will does exist.
Right. So, what is that? And that what?
And that determinism is wrong.
Right, exactly. They're going to assert the truth of free will, and they're going to say, so determinism is false. What is happening now and what is happening in the future isn't determined by forces outside of our control. We have some sort of say in what happens and what the future is going to look like. And these positions fall under the umbrella of incompatibilism. They believe that free will and determinism are incompatible. So you can't have them together. It's either free will exists or determinism is true. One of those is true. Both of them can't be true. But there's a whole separate group of people that disagree with this claim that free will and determinism are incompatible. These are the compatibilists. They think that what we mean when we say free will isn't some magical God power being able to stand above nature and do whatever the hell we want. The compatibilists have a different view of free will. They just think what it means to say someone has free will is that they weren't forced to do the thing that they did by somebody else or something else. So, the compatibilists are going to say free will and determinism are compatible. There's no issue here. Just because one is true doesn't make the other untrue. There's another view, though, too, that differs from incompatibilism and compatibilism. And this is what Strawson calls pessimism, or what my philosophy undergrad professor used to call no free will either wayism. What do you think these people believe? Yeah.
There's no free will either way.
No free will either way. If the universe is deterministic, that means we don't have free will. But if the universe is indeterministic, if it's random, that also means we don't have free will. If stuff just happens randomly, that means we don't have control over what's going on. So they're going to say there's no free will regardless of whether determinism is true or not. They think it doesn't matter if we find out that the universe is deterministic or indeterministic. There's no room for free will in either one of these scenarios. No free will either way. Now these are the different camps of the free will debate. And like I said, this debate has been going on for a very, very long time. And not very much progress has been made because we seemingly haven't come to an answer on the issue of whether or not free will exists. Now we're going to get into why people think free will exists and why we haven't made much progress here in a little bit. But let me now kind of go through the brief things that Strawson has to say about this whole thing before we jump into our own discussion. The reason Strawson is interested in talking about this stuff is because, well, he's interested in trying to understand the nature of the universe, but he's also interested in philosophy of mind. So he's trying to understand how it is that we have a consciousness, and depending on what our consciousness is, what that implies about whether or not we have this ability to make choices and actually determine our own fates. He's still alive, although he's doing more philosophy of mind stuff now than this free will stuff. in this reading, we basically see Strawson just providing us a brief overview of this debate. And he's going to connect this debate to the question of moral responsibility. And as we see in this piece, he actually comes down on one side or another. He doesn't have some positive things to say about us being morally responsible for our actions. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that he says, nobody is morally responsible for what they do. And this is a very radical claim. But I'm going to walk you through his argument now kind of step by step. He offers this really long argument, but I'm going to try to break it down a little bit for you. This is what he has to say about this whole issue. If you have the text in front of you, I am on page 4 in the document, where he starts his argument, or what he calls the Pessimists Argument. One way of setting out the Pessimists Argument is as follows. When you act, you do what you do because of the way that you are. But then, to be truly or ultimately morally responsible for what you do, you must be truly or ultimately responsible for the way that you are, at least in certain mental respects. But you can't be morally responsible for the way that you are in any respect at all. So you can't be ultimately responsible for what you do. Now here's his rationale. To be ultimately responsible for the way that you are, you must have somehow intentionally brought it about that you are the way that you are. And then the problem is this. Suppose you have somehow intentionally brought it about that you are the way that you are now in certain mental respects. Suppose that you have brought it about that you have a certain mental nature, Z, in such a way that you can be said to be ultimately responsible for Z. But for this to be true, you must have already had a certain mental nature Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have the mental nature Z. If you didn't already have a mental nature, then you didn't have any intentions or preferences and can't be responsible for the way that you are now, even if you have changed. But then, for it to be true that you are morally and ultimately responsible for how you are now, you must be ultimately responsible for having had that nature Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have Z, so you must have brought it about that you had the mental nature Y. You see where this is going to be going, right? There's an infinite regress. In order to bring it about that you had a mental nature Y, that brought about the mental nature Z, that brought about your action, you had to have a mental nature X before that brought Y about. You must have existed already, with a prior nature X, in the light of which you brought it about that you had Y, in the light of which you brought it about that you now have Z, and so on. Here one is setting off a potentially infinite regress. In order for one to be truly or ultimately responsible for how one is, in such a way that one can be truly responsible for what one does, something impossible has to be true. There has to be, but cannot be, A starting point in the series of acts of bringing it about that one has a certain nature. A starting point that constitutes an act of ultimate self-origination. He's basically saying, because we did not and cannot create ourselves, we cannot be morally responsible for the actions that flow from who we are. You didn't decide to have the genes that you do. You didn't decide to have the DNA that you do, or the bodies that you do, or the traits that you have. You had no control over any of this, right? You didn't even bring yourself into existence. Your parents had to do that, right? And so, because we did not create ourselves, and we can't create ourselves, we can't be responsible for who we are, and thus we can't be responsible for the actions that flow from who we are. I'm going to rewrite this argument in a slightly shorter way. In order to be morally responsible, an agent must be responsible for what she does. However, in order to be responsible for what you do, you have to be responsible for who you are that brought that action about. So you had to have intentionally brought it about that you are who you are if you're going to be responsible for the actions that flow from who you are. But we can't be the ultimate cause of who we are. We can't pull ourselves out by our bootstraps of our conditioning and our genes and our biology and our biases and our prejudices. These are all baked into us and we don't have control over these things. So, we can't be the ultimate cause of who we are. There's a Latin phrase for this, being the cause of oneself, called causa sui. We cannot be causa sui. So what does this imply? Since we didn't bring it about, that since we didn't bring it about who we are, we're not morally responsible for the actions that flow from who we are. So nobody is ultimately responsible for what they do. I feel like I'm in an It's Always Sunny episode. This thing like stinks. I feel like I'm sniffing markers up here by myself. And so this is the argument that he gives. He says, no, nobody intentionally brought it about that they are who they are, nor can they. They can't bootstrap themselves up out of their biology and their chemistry and their upbringing and their education. It's impossible. So, since we're not in control of who we are, that means we're not in control of what we do, because what we do flows from who we are. Now, you might think that claim is a little tenuous, but it makes a lot of sense if you just consider something other than a human. Can this eraser crush a diamond? No. Why can't it crush a diamond? Because of the way that it is. The same is true of humans. What we do and how we do it is inevitably influenced by what we are made of and who we are. So, what Strawson presents us with is a pessimist argument that has nothing to do really with determinism or indeterminism. He's not even talking about that, because he's saying it's impossible for us to create ourselves. So he's saying this is an argument that we're not going to be able to have free will either way of what science tells us about whether or not future events are determined beforehand. And so what he suggests is, since this debate has been going on for so long, and we haven't really made any headway, and we're still arguing about all the same things that we have been for thousands of years, we need to toss the debate out entirely. Did anybody catch what he suggests that we do next? In order to figure out more about this and our path forward? He says we just got to dive into psychology. He says we got to do psychological research and try to understand how the mind works. Because once we do that, we'll understand why people have the views that they have about free will. And why we're having this debate, and why this debate matters at all. So he encourages us to, quote, get off the metaphysical merry-go-round and to dive into psychology to understand why we're having this debate in the first place, why the debate looks the way it does, and why we're not able to progress it any further. Let me diagram some of the positions, some of the camps again, just so you have a more pictorial representation of this stuff. And then we can start talking about it. So you can either be an incompatibilist or a compatibilist, right? Or, of course, you can be a pessimist. You can say, it doesn't matter what the hell these camps are arguing about. We have arguments that free will doesn't and never will exist. And then if you're an incompatibilist, you can be a hard determinist. You can think free will does not exist because determinism is true. Or you can be a libertarian and you can say, no, I actually think free will exists. I don't think what happens in the future is determined by the conditions right now. I'm going to do this. There we go. I don't expect we're going to get very far in our conversation, but let's have it nonetheless. Is this a question that y'all have thought about before? Is this something that keeps you up at night? Are you worried about it? Or do you think having this discussion is just, it doesn't matter anyway? What are some of your thoughts? Yeah.
I think part of it for me is that, like, I just think my idea of free will fits more with, like, the compatibilist concept, where it's like, well, sure, people are, like, a result of, like, what they've gone through and the way they've developed. There's still, like, there's a set of, like, mental processes that all people go through, and there's no sort of outside force that, like, pushes someone's hand to, like, pull the trigger of a gun. They're still at that point where, while they're pointing a gun at a person, they have to consciously sort of activate the processes that make their finger pull the trigger.
Right.
Where they could equally, if there's no outside force stopping them from deciding not to do that.
Right, yeah, that's a very compatibilist position. The compatibilists are going to say, this whole free will thing, you're just expecting way too much out of what people should be able to do. What it means to be responsible for something, the compatibilists think, is you weren't forced into it. Somebody didn't hold a gun to your head. If you weren't forced into it, then you're morally responsible for it. The libertarians, on the other hand, are going to say, no, that doesn't seem to capture what we mean to say by free will. We mean to say something stronger, something more robust. Because the compatibilists are going to concede, yeah, your upbringing and your education and your religion, all of this stuff kind of determined what you were going to do, even though you weren't forced to do it. But the libertarians are going to say, no, you need to be able to decide what you want to do at every point. Maybe your past and your prejudices influence you, but they don't determine your actions.
I feel like it also, like in my brain, it's kind of like you don't really get to control how you were brought up or, like, the experiences that you have. Like, you have no control over what other people do to you. And so it's kind of like, for example, like, if somebody, like, the average person is like, how could somebody murder someone? Like, in my brain, I could never. But somebody else, like, in that decision, they're like, yeah, I'm gonna murder. Where, like, most people would be like, I'm not gonna do that. And then you see it in, like, courts and stuff, where it's like, for example, like, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, if you know who that is.
No, please explain.
She is, it's kind of hard to explain. So she's this girl who killed her mom because her mother, for, like, the first 20 years of her life, was, like, making it so, like, she was considered a child and she had all these medical issues and, like, kept her wheelchair bound without telling her that she didn't have all these medical issues. And so she ended up killing her mother. And so in court, they were telling about, like, the upbringing that kind of brought on this murder, and, like, it kind of brings into your brain that's like, well, was it justified? Where it's like, is murder really justified? But then it's also like a shitty situation brought on a completely other shitty situation.
Right. Right, yeah, it's a very sticky question, right? Because there are some cases in which we want to say, oh, that person was insane, you know, he didn't know what he was doing. But then there are some cases where we're like, if they were in their right mind, we certainly want to punish them for what they did, right? That seems appropriate for the crime, some crimes, right? It brings up an interesting question. Who is and isn't morally responsible for their actions? There are different cases that we can consider, right? What about someone who's mind controlled? If while you were sleeping last night, I snuck into your room and did some brain surgery, and now I can control the brain waves with my little controller in my pocket, and I can make you do things, are you morally responsible for your actions? We generally want to say no, right? It's like you don't have control over what's going on mentally. I'm making you have certain ideas and am causing you to do certain things.
I mean, there was recently this like case of this kid who murdered his friend while he was sleepwalking,
Right.
and so it's like,
How do you prove
right, that
he was even
responsible.
conscious, right? So this case seems kind of cut and dry, right? We're kind of like, all right, people who are mind controlled literally by like a device in the brain, they don't seem morally responsible for their actions because somebody else is controlling them, right?
For the comparables, like, what if somebody was like holding a gun to your head, but then they gave you a gun and they were like, you can either kill this person in front of you, or you can take the bullet and you'll die. Would they still consider that being like forced, or like they're still giving you a choice? You're just like, me.
That's a great question. I think it would vary by each compatibilist, probably. I don't know. What do y'all think about that? I would say you're still morally responsible. Now, just because you're morally responsible for the action doesn't necessarily mean that we should punish you. That's another question, thing we can talk through. Yeah.
Like, that's just like limiting your choices. Like he talks about, like you have, no matter like what situation, you always have limited choices. So like,
Right.
you know, you go to ice cream shop that only has 2 flavors, you only have 2 choices there. You know, he was talking about the man with the tin can and go and buy the cake. But you have the $10, go buy the cake, or give it to the homeless man.
Yeah.
It's like, and that you still have the decision. It's just so limited that it's like either your life or someone else's, and like that just comes out of like your moral obligations as a person.
Right. Right. Yeah.
It's just an extreme case of limited choices.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. Consider these people then. Consider people who are addicts. If somebody is really addicted to meth and they steal a car and sell it so they can feed their drug habit, are they responsible for that action? What do you think?
I would say that they are because, I mean, from like a psychology standpoint, because I'm a psychology major, like the idea of what is morally correct in my mind really depends on the person. So like in their head, what they're doing is probably completely fine because why wouldn't they steal a car? But to us, we would be like, that's really messed up. So I feel like it depends on your view of who you are versus like looking on the inside versus being that person, like putting yourself in their shoes, I guess.
Right. The question, a question like this about the behavior of people who are really addicted to drugs is harder than mind control, because we know that addiction is structured by real neural circuits in the brain. Right? If you have an addiction to something, you have neural circuitry that is playing out. That is not, you are not in control of whether or not you have urges to imbibe the drug. Right? So it's like, partly, maybe you're responsible for becoming a drug addict, but then, does that mean you're responsible for everything that you do as a drug addict because you got yourself to that point? Yeah.
In high school, I did a film project where we met with the recovered addict and we met with doctors and stuff, and the word that the doctor used to describe addiction was hijacking of the brain, which makes me think that they are partially responsible, but once they're down in that spiral, then they no longer have that control of their mental.
Yeah, what do y'all think about that? We certainly want to have compassion for people, right, who are suffering in this way. But at the same time, can we just let anybody do whatever the hell that they want? You know?
I don't even think that's too big of a conversation because if we're debating whether them being a drug addict and then stealing a car is wrong, well, drugs are illegal to begin with, so who cares what they did after that fact? Like, they're already in the wrong by doing drugs. So it's like, if we're talking like legal system-wise, like, I mean, they're wrong from the beginning, like drugs are illegal to begin with, so that could be the end of it, like, that was wrong.
This brings up a whole other discussion. Is the law the same as what's right? Do you think doing drugs is immoral?
I mean, I wouldn't put it that way, but I would say strictly the conversation of the legal system
Right.
that we were just talking about, that's how I view it, but I don't know, that's a totally different thing to like even talk about.
Right, yeah. I mean, we can have discussions about, moral responsibility, and we can have discussions about legality. Even if something isn't morally responsible, or even if something isn't immoral, are there cases that we should still punish or make an example out of the person? Maybe? Maybe not? Yeah, this is a whole other discussion though, but yeah.
Kind of like tying in like the law and what he's saying about, like, I always view people with addiction, like, it's completely out of their control. And again, it comes down to a limit of choices, because in their heads, either they stop using drugs, go through relapse, end up probably in jail, because we don't really have programs to actually, well, we technically have rehab programs, but they're not very well functioning in America, at least, if we're talking about the United States at least. So the decision to steal a car is like, in their head, that seems like the best option opposed to putting themselves in jail. So that's that
Right.
limit of choices again, where maybe if they had that third choice to go to an actual, because like in or like European countries that are a lot better, like rehab facilities would actually, treat the person like a mental illness patient, like someone with mental illness, and slowly will get them off their drug. But that's not really an option in like the United States, so it's like jail where you'll still deal with like your relapse and have a miserable time, or steal a car, ruin someone else's day, but you get to keep using the drug that your brain is telling you that you absolutely need.
Right.
So it's like, I don't hold them necessarily more responsible for their addiction, because again, like half the time people get addicted off opioids that the doctors prescribe them. So it's like, is it the doctor's fault? It's like, it just endlessly goes on. So obviously they shouldn't steal a car, that's bad for their person, but they should also have more choices, because it's that limit of choices, I think, is what causes people to make bad decisions.
You think our social system is set up in a way to kind of produce failure for a lot of people?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right, well, let's have some real talk here for a second. I bet there are several addicts in this room. Who here can't go a day without having their phone? Or social media? Or YouTube? I watch YouTube every day. Now maybe I could go without it, but I sure as hell ain't going to be very happy if I make myself do that. So, if you get caught up scrolling, late at night, and then you sleep through your alarm and you miss philosophy class, are you morally responsible for missing class? What do you think?
I think, I don't think we have free will. Like, I think it's just like that whatever happens is probably kind of predetermined or like is going to happen regardless. I guess the pessimist view. But
Yeah, and it doesn't, yeah, so sorry to interject, but in this context, it's the pessimist view, but you don't have to look at it pessimistically. You can be like, the threads of fate have determined me, to whatever, and you can have a very mystical, beautiful view of it or whatever.
About it. It's not like, it's kind of exciting. I don't know. I'd rather think that I don't have it. Anyhow, I think that even if we don't have free will, we still have like a cause and effect. So like even if you're an addict and you don't have control over your addiction, you still have to deal with the effects. And it's just like the system on a whole isn't fair. Like it's not. There's never going to be a fair answer to the free will question.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you hear it all the time, it's a cliche, but life isn't fair, right? People are born in disadvantaged positions. Some people are born in advantaged positions. Some people are born with things that seem genetically predisposed to addiction, and some people don't. For some people, studying comes easy, and for some people, it's very hard to focus and study, right? So this really is, it's a thorny issue because you really kind of have to look at it in a case-by-case basis, right? I mean, you have to look at all the factors of what's going on with that person in the situation.
Honestly, I feel like it's not really a case of arguing for one kind of side or one camp. It's really like putting them together, because in one way, if you think strictly pessimistically, or in that case, what is called pessimistically, it can lead to like not trying to get things or not working to get things. It's just, oh well, it's predetermined, so whatever happens happens. I don't have to work for it.
Right.
So that can lay down a really bad time for that person, because if they just rely on the universe or whatever that predetermines to do something for them, they'll never actually get anywhere.
Yeah.
But if you think too strictly to like, you have free will over everything and you have to make a choice for everything, it can also lead to that, because it can just lead to like kind of toxic, like, well, you chose to do that, so everything
that follows from that is your fault, right? Or whatever.
Because there's like mental illnesses and there's ways that people's brains work differently from other people's. Like brains aren't the same. You could be, it's extremely like a high functioning sociopath. You don't have the same kind of mental processes as everyone else, so it's a lot different.
Right, yeah, so you're saying, maybe what we need is more of a balanced understanding of when moral responsibility matters, when the question of free will matters, and when it doesn't. Right? Because some things seem beyond our control, and some things don't. They seem like they were the consequences of our own actions, or of other people's actions and stuff. Well, let's bring up another case. How about people who grew up in cults? Somebody who, from a very early age, was indoctrinated in a particular ideology or worldview that colors how they see everything and how they act and how they judge others. Is this person morally responsible for, judging you and saying you're going to hell and treating you meanly? Because they were raised believing that from a very early age, for example?
I feel like it honestly depends on like how in a cult they were, because I know some people, or like not personally, but like I've watched documentaries like on some people like in cults where there's like no technology, like you can't read any books that aren't like available to you in your church or your home or wherever. So they don't have the resources to like learn for themselves. They only hear what is being taught to them or what they have like the availability to read. But like I think that if you're in like a, I don't know, what we would consider like your regular home, but like I don't know, your parents indoctrinated certain beliefs in you. I don't know if you're considering that a cult. I mean, from your description, I guess it is.
Yeah,
But,
I'm using this term rather loosely.
Yeah.
You could maybe replace it with religion or
Mhm.
ideology or whatever.
I feel like if you have the resources to like learn for yourself and like I don't know, you're able to do that, then you're kind of responsible. Um, but yeah, like I don't know, if you're being cut off to the outside world completely, like you have no idea what's out there, and you can't even like you don't have the ways to figure it out. Like, I don't know.
Right. So yeah, so maybe there's a distinction between people who are cut off and are still in this, and people who have broken away, and they've left the place, and now they're seeing the world and stuff, and coming to understand themselves better and everything. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think there's something to be said on like the age of the person because like and also like obviously the level of cult it is and like what you're doing, but like a child who's still in that cult atmosphere, they might do that thing, but they're also like you said before have fewer choices as not only a member of a cult but also a child who doesn't have any sort of like legal autonomy. Whereas like and it, when you get to a certain age, like obviously it's very difficult to get out of those cult situations. You have to lose a lot of support systems, but you do have and more of an ability to. Whereas like, and it's also dependent on what you do through that. Like if you're telling people they should go to hell or they will be going to hell, I might disagree with them, but like they're not like causing as much harm. Whereas if it's like some like Waco, Texas ritual sacrifice situation, and you're an adult who's participating in it, you do have more of an ability to say no and attempt to leave.
Got it. Yeah, all good points. Again, it's like even framing it in this way is a little disingenuous because we want to look at it at a case by case basis, right? So it's gonna depend on the factors.
I kind of look at it as like not as much like a cult standard, but like what if someone, what if like Stockholm syndrome or something like that, right? Like what if someone's like kind of abducted or kidnapped or whatever, and they get used to one thing for so long that their whole like sense of morality and like what they think is right or wrong and like what should be and what shouldn't be is completely warped because they've been like I wouldn't say brainwashed, but almost sort of like taught over and over forcefully to like
Right.
believe something.
Right, yeah. Well, this brings up the next thing that I was going to mention. And again, this is probably going to have to be determined on a case by case basis. What about people with mental illnesses? Is your cousin who's bipolar morally responsible for, what he did to you when he was having a manic episode? If it's like a really intense thing? Is someone who is extremely depressed morally responsible for not taking care of themselves? These are hard questions. And trying to figure out the extent to which a mental illness has captured someone is a very difficult thing to do, right? We might as well just write maybe for all of these, right? Yeah.
I feel like, and again, not to get back into the very complicated like legal versus moral situation. I think a lot of this comes down to like the difference between being morally responsible and like being punished for something.
Okay.
I think a lot of these situations, they are morally responsible, but I feel like the punishment shouldn't be, maybe shouldn't be like jail time or complete like social excommunication, whereas a sort of focus on like rehabilitation and like mental health like focus, it would be a more like reasonable like way to help with addicts who are turning to things or people with mental illness who are like like harming people around them. It doesn't excuse the action, but it's a more understandable consequence.
Right? Maybe framing it this way isn't even very helpful. Maybe we should be talking about, socio-political measures that we can take to rehabilitate people who are struggling with things over which they don't have a lot of control. Maybe that would be a more useful discussion to have.
Like, my question is like, what definition of morally responsible are we going off of? Because of course there's like the societal like morals, but there's also like each person has their own individual morals, and it kind of makes me think of like the like trolley train car like thing where it's like there's a train coming down the tracks and there's two things, and one of the tracks has babies on it and one of them has grandmas on it, and you can't stop the train, but you can decide which rail it goes down. Do you kill the babies or do you kill the grandmas? And it's like everyone's gonna have a different decision here. And some people are gonna think that your decision wasn't the morally responsible one, or some people are going to think your decision was the morally responsible one. Or some people will be like, there should have been another option, but like there's not.
But yeah, this is known in philosophy as the trolley problem. Okay? Imagine there's a trolley coming down the tracks, and you're right next to the switch, okay? You can decide where it's going to go. If you don't move the switch, it's going to kill 4 workmen that are on the tracks. If you do move the switch, you kill your mom. What's the moral action here? Do you let the 4 people die, or do you kill your mom? You flip the switch. People have been arguing about this for a long time too. It depends broadly on what your ethical theory is. If you're a utilitarian, you're going to say, mom's got to go. We got to produce the most happiness for the most amount of people. That means saving the most amount of people. But there's a distinction between killing and letting die. If you pull the switch, because the train was going to go to the 4 people anyway, if you pull the switch, you're killing your mom. But if you don't touch the switch, you're just letting 4 people die. If you're just letting someone die, are you morally responsible for that? You're certainly responsible if you kill someone, right? But yeah, anyway, I don't want to get too much into this. Do you have one comment you want to say about it?
I was just going to say that another layer of that is you don't know anything about the strangers. You don't know about the lives that they've lived. You don't know, like...
What if one of these is a serial killer? You
Right.
just saved a serial killer.
Like, exactly. Like, you don't know. So, I would honestly, I wouldn't touch it. Just let fate do what fate's going to do.
The threads of fate.
Even if my
It was
mom was on the
woven.
other side, it's like...
It was woven that the workmen were to die, unfortunately. But these questions of free will and moral responsibility don't just have to do with ethics and politics. The reason why I'm introducing this issue or this question to you is because your metaphysical and your epistemological stances are going to influence whether or not you think you have free will. If you think you're just a physical thing like an eraser is, being pushed and pulled by physical and chemical processes, you're not going to think you have free will, right? You might not even think that you're a person or an agent. You're just like a complex biochemical machine or something, right? When we're talking about this question, there are certain preliminary questions that we have to reckon with. Are we determined to think and act how we do? Do you have control over the thoughts that you have? Or are your thoughts and mental processes completely out of your control? Do you have some influence over them or not? And furthermore, bless you, are we caught up in the processes of nature like an electron or a proton is? Or do we, in a sense, stand above nature? Are we removed partly from the cause and effects of what happens with erasers and water bottles and tables and neutron stars? Are we a part of nature or are we separate from it? Another way of framing this question is, are we a brain just doing brain stuff? Or is there like a spirit inside of here that's like inhabiting our bodies like a mech? You know? Your answers to these questions are going to have consequences for what you think about the free will debate. And consequently, what you think of moral responsibility, too. If we are a spirit that's inhabiting a body, that is controlling kind of our body, then we do kind of stand above nature, and we can make decisions, and we can make stuff happen. And we are in control, at least partly, of our destiny. So we are morally responsible for that stuff. But if we're just biochemical complex machines, like animals or plants, then what happens just kind of happens to us. And we see it, you know, we're aware of it, we're perceiving stuff, but we don't have any control over it. You know, you can't control that your heart beats or your blood flows or what your brain's doing or whether or not you fall in love with that person, even if you want to, right? That's why I decided to put kind of this discussion within this unit, because this discussion about free will and moral responsibility is intimately connected to all of these metaphysical and epistemological questions and views we've been looking at so far. What were to happen if we were to give up on free will? What if we all accepted free will doesn't exist? What would that imply for what we think about ourselves and how we think we should order society? We touched on a few of the implications last time, right? Near the end of class. It would seem that if free will doesn't exist, it's not fair that we punish people, right? If people aren't in control of their actions, if people don't have free will, then they don't have the option of murdering the person or not murdering the person. They're determined to murder the person, right? It's not within their control. So maybe one implication of accepting that free will doesn't exist is we would have to give up punishment. We'd have to eradicate our whole prison industrial complex. No more locking people up, no more punishing them. One philosopher actually goes further than this. He says not only would we have to give up punishment, we would be morally obligated to engage in what he calls punishment. We would have to make people who we need to quarantine because they're dangerous to themselves or others, as happy and content as possible. So we give them TVs, and we give them candy, and we give them an exercise room, and would we have to engage in punishment if free will doesn't exist? Would we have to make the lives of even people who have done heinous things extremely pleasurable? Because it's not their fault that they did what they did. What do y'all think about this point?
I feel like if we're talking that we don't have free will, then we don't even have, like, I don't know, the will to decide what we do. It's just gonna be done. Like, how can we even discuss this? Whatever's gonna happen will happen.
Ah, that's an interesting point. Maybe the discussion that we're having now is completely fruitless. If determinism is true, it doesn't matter what I say, it doesn't matter the experiences that you have in this class, you're either determined to believe free will exists or you're determined to believe it doesn't. And there's nothing anyone can do about it. And there's no amount of convincing in the world that's ever going to change anything. So yeah, why even talk about this at all if free will doesn't exist? The answer is we can't do otherwise. Right? We're having the discussion about free will.
I guess you're right.
Yeah, we can't do otherwise, right? We're stuck having it because, well, we're determined to have it because we're having it right now, right?
Well, why would we say that you wouldn't get punished if it's like psychologically proven that conditioning people and pets and stuff changes their action?
Are people responsible for the conditioning that they receive from others?
But wouldn't we condition them to change their action?
Yeah, we can try to condition people probably. Well, we're either going to try to condition people or we're not, if determinism is true. But yeah, conditioning influences people, it seems. But the deeper question is, did anybody have a choice in participating or engaging in the conditioning in the first place? You know, it's the same question that you kind of asked, you know. Why are we having a discussion about what we should do if we're just going to do what we're determined to do? The same kind of question applies to what you're saying. You know, it's, well, this whole talk of conditioning, if determinism is true, we're either going to condition people to be better or we won't. You know, so should we talk about doing it? Does that even make sense? It does if you believe free will exists. Right?
But then it also like begs the question of like, will conditioning people actually condition them, or will it just make them know what you want them to do so they can act like they're conditioned, but actually just not be?
Right. Yeah, who knows the way people's brains work? You know? Although, if we did try conditioning in rehabilitation, and it worked or didn't work, that wouldn't be anybody's fault, you know, or it wouldn't be helped. It couldn't be helped if determinism is true, right? We'd be determined to try the conditioning or not. And then people would be determined to be influenced by it or not. So it's really strange kind of having this conversation, right? Because when you start thinking about how often you take it for granted that you have control over what you do, it really exposes a lot of these interesting issues that we don't really bring to the forefront of our consciousness, right? Stuff that we argue about, but we kind of have views about it and we leave it in the background. There are no final answers to these questions, I don't think.
Well, my only thinking on it is like, if we don't have like a scroll that says what is determined, so functionally, like, while we may be while it's predetermined, we still don't know what is going to happen. So
Right,
it does
right.
still functionally appear the same as if we had free will, because in that situation we don't know what else it could be. And so it'll still feel as though you have free will, and as if what you're doing affects things. Because even if it's predetermined, like, if you say this is all predetermined, so I'm going to choose to sit in my room and do nothing, then you're not actually making a choice because that was just predetermined anyway.
Right. Right. Ignorance and the feeling that we have control over our actions are big reasons why people believe free will exists. Right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We can't predict it. We don't know what our lives are going to look like 20 years from now. Right? And I had in my notes some points of arguments for and against free will, and I think you've nailed one of them for free will, which is we're never going to be able to give up the feeling that we have it. You know, that's not you might believe determinism is true, but you're never going to feel determinism is true. Except in maybe particular instances in which things are radically out of your control. Right? I can pick up a laptop if I want. You know, I can drink from the water bottle if I want. I can throw the marker, you know? And our whole lives are just instances of this over and over and over again, you know? But let's talk about a different implication here. One thing that we would have to do, if we all came to accept that free will doesn't exist, is we would have to rethink all of our major religions. Let's take Christianity, for example. The fundamentalist view of Christianity is we all have a soul that's eternal, that's going to go to a place, heaven or hell, when we die. And that this is somehow based on the faith that we have in the gospel message and perhaps our actions here on earth. If determinism is true, we're either determined to believe that Jesus is our Savior or not. If determinism is true, we're either determined to do the actions that we do, or we're determined to do something else, right? So on what basis could we fervently believe that it's fair to send someone to heaven or hell when they have no control over their lives and what they do and what they believe? You might look at Buddhism, for example, also. There's this whole notion that what's keeping the whole cycle going is desire. The reason why there is existence in the first place springs from an existential imbalance in our understanding of the world and karma that develops through the initiation of actions. Well, if nobody has control over the actions that they do, is it fair for us to believe, or is it reasonable for us to think that, oh, they have a lot of karma, so they're going to come back as something else because they've been doing all these actions? You know, they don't have control over the kind of karma that develops from their actions because they don't have control over what they do. So you're either stuck in the cycle, or maybe you're determined eventually to reach nirvana if you're lucky.
I find a lot that like some Christians like really contradict themselves. So like when they like tell people that like, oh, you're a sinner, you're going to hell, they also like say things like, oh, well, this is God's plan. So it's like, oh, so if this is God's plan, then it was God's plan to make that person sin or make that person not believe in God.
This is a huge issue in the theology of Christianity that is still being debated today, which is, if God knows everything, does God know what you're going to do in the future? And if God knows what you're going to do in the future, can you do otherwise? Because if he knows it, it's like set in stone, right? You can't change it. So then, yeah, what does that say about our existence after we die? You know, is it fair that God sends people to heaven or hell? You know, when he knew that they were either going to be a believer or not a believer, and they didn't have any control over that?
Christianity also states that God gave people free will. So I don't understand the whole God's plan perspective. I grew up Catholic, by the way, so that's my background. I'm no longer religious, but ever since I was like a kid, like I never understood like it was part of God's plan. It's like no, like God gave us free will. Like
Did you ever read that in the Bible?
that's what I heard in CCD, church, Bible study. All it's everyone always said God gave us free will.
You want to know what's really interesting?
Does it say in the Bible?
Not only does it not say it in the Bible, I was raised Protestant, Lutheran to be exact, and it was pounded into my head that nobody has free will.
That's so funny.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
How even different denominations within the church are arguing about this very fundamental question and what its implications could be, for the religion. Yeah, talk to my dad. He'll talk you up a wall about the whole issue. He'll tell you to read Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will, which is a great book, by the way, but...
So I just have a question. For like, when we're talking about determinism and like everything's already planned out, is that like, does he believe that everyone individually, like chemically, we just have everything planned out, or there's someone above us that planned everything out for us?
In relation to, did you say Christianity?
No, like just determinism in general. Like, does he
Oh.
believe that there's someone that planned this out for us, or does he believe that individually we were all just born with a plan, and no one like went through and purposely picked out a plan for everyone?
If you're a determinist, you could take either position. Most people who are determinists are empirical scientists, and so they're going to say everything that has happened since the Big Bang was determined by the initial conditions of our universe. So, you going to Starbucks tomorrow, that was going to happen based on how all of the particles, where they were at and how they were interacting when our universe came into existence. So you can trace the series of causes all the way back to that point. And so there isn't, a God that's like planning everything out for you, but it's just, you're a slave to your physicality, of your particles and processes that's happening, which were determined by, whatever was going on in your parents' bodies, which is determined by, whatever they were perceiving in their environment, which is determined by everything that happened before that. You see how it goes, you just trace it back, and it's like, all right, the reason this happened is because all this was this way, the reason this happened was because all this was this way, and so on and so forth back to the beginning of the universe. But yeah, you can be a Christian and think, and be a determinist.
I'm just gonna say, because if it was that, like, if you took that standpoint on it, that, like, God was the one that chose everyone's plan, then wouldn't you think that everyone believed in the exact same religion if it was God that was putting everyone's plan, like everyone would believe in him? So that's why I was confused on if it was just an individual thing, or if, like, one person put all of this on us. I guess
Right.
that makes sense.
Right, yeah. Well, you can still, of course, believe that part of God's plan is that not everybody believes. Of course, that raises other questions. Maybe we'll get into those later. There's one more thing. Maybe y'all won't find this that interesting. If we give up on free will, you know what we also have to give up on? Rationality. Calling or judging people rational or irrational. You can't call somebody rational if they don't have any choices. Right? We say someone is rational because they made the logical choice, right? Or they followed the logic, or they did the logical thing. But if you don't have a choice in what you do or how you think, it doesn't make any sense to call someone rational or irrational, because they didn't have a choice in how they thought, whether they followed the logic or not, or whether they did the rational thing. which is an interesting idea too. And so I'll leave you with this question. We've been talking about free will this whole time and its implications for moral responsibility. But once you study this issue long enough, a question makes itself apparent to you that casts this whole debate in a new light. And that is, can we ever know if we're free? Because all of what we've been talking about has been predicated on the idea that we know that we're free or not. And so this follows from that, or that follows from this. But if we can't ever know that we're free or unfree, we have no justification for giving up or not giving up any of these things. Right? I don't think we're ever going to be able to know. I don't think that's something that's possible for us. And so, try not to get yourself tied up in a bunch of knots thinking about this question endlessly. Because I don't think, there might be an answer to it, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to come to the answer. What do you all think? Do you think this is something we're going to be able to figure out? A lot of people think if we just keep studying science and psychology and the mind, we'll figure it out. And we'll know if we're free or not. I'm a little more pessimistic about that possibility. Who thinks we're going to be able to know if we're free someday? If we have free will? You all believe that we're not going to know? Or not going to be able to know? No?
I don't think not that we're dead.
Not till we're dead. If we're dead, can we know anything? That's... yeah. So it's a fun issue to talk about. It's a fun debate to have with your friends. But don't drive yourself crazy over it. I did for a few years. Don't take that path. All right, that's all I got for you today. I will see you all on Monday. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me.